Before we begin, if you've ever loved your grandmother, or if someone once believed in you when the world didn't, this story is for you. Take a second to breathe, sit back, and listen closely. Stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us who we are. If you feel something while listening, if this story touches your heart even a little, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. I remember the first time I truly saw my grandmother as a human being, not just the old woman who smelled like lavender soap and boiled coffee. It was a cold morning, the kind where the air feels sharp in your lungs, and the house creaks like it's waking up reluctantly. I was 9 years old, sitting on the wooden floor near the kitchen table, watching her hands move slowly as she kneaded dough. Her fingers were bent, swollen from years of work, and there were tiny scars I had never noticed before. I asked her where they came from, and she didn't answer right away. She just kept kneading, her breath steady, her eyes distant, like she was somewhere far away. Then she said softly, "From surviving." My grandmother's name was Evelyn, but everyone called her Grandma Evie. She lived in a small house at the edge of town, paint peeling, porch sagging just a little, but somehow it always felt warmer than any other place in the world. That house had heard laughter, crying, arguments, prayers, and long nights of silence. She had lived there alone since my grandfather passed away, yet she never complained about loneliness. Lonely is when you give up, she once told me. Being alone is just quiet. She was born in the late 1930s, during a time when life didn't ask if you were ready. It just came at you, hard and fast. Her childhood was shaped by poverty so deep it wasn't spoken about. It was simply understood. Shoes were worn until the soles begged for mercy. Meals were shared and sometimes skipped. Love existed, but it was wrapped in exhaustion. Her father worked until his back gave out, and her mother stitched clothes late into the night by a single dim bulb. Grandma Evie learned early that if she wanted something done, she had to do it herself. By the time she was 12, she was already working, cleaning houses for people who barely looked at her. She told me once how she would stand in their kitchens, hands red from scrubbing, listening to their conversations about vacations and new cars, wondering what it would feel like to live without fear of tomorrow. But she never let bitterness settle in her heart. "Anger is heavy," she said. "I didn't have room to carry it." When she was 17, she fell in love with my grandfather, a quiet man with kind eyes and dreams bigger than his circumstances. They married young, not because life was perfect, but because they believed they could face it together. Those early years were brutal. Bills stacked up faster than hope, and some nights dinner was nothing more than bread and water. But Grandma Evie used to say those were the years that taught her the true meaning of strength. "Love isn't roses and music," she said. "Love is staying when it's hard." She had 3 children, including my mother, and every one of them remembers her not as a woman who complained, but as a woman who endured. She worked factory jobs, night shifts, anything that would put food on the table. She missed school plays and birthdays, not because she didn't care, but because survival didn't pause for celebrations. Still, she found ways to show love: handwritten notes in lunch bags, a kiss on the forehead before sunrise, prayers whispered over sleeping children. Life didn't reward her for her sacrifices. My grandfather died suddenly when she was in her 50s, leaving her with grief so deep it settled into her bones. I remember the day of the funeral. She stood straight, dressed in black, eyes red but dry. People whispered about how strong she was, how brave. But later that night, I heard her crying alone in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her standing. That was the moment I understood that strength isn't the absence of pain. It's living with it and moving forward anyway. After his death, the world seemed to forget her. Friends drifted away, family got busy, and the phone rang less and less. But Grandma Evie didn't fade. She planted a garden, started baking again, and opened her home to anyone who needed a place to feel safe. Neighborhood kids would stop by after school, and she'd listen to their problems like they were the most important things in the world. She never rushed anyone, she never judged, she just listened. When I was a teenager, lost and angry at everything, she became my anchor. I would sit across from her at the kitchen table, ranting about how unfair life was, how nothing made sense. She'd sip her tea, nodding, letting me unload all my frustration. When I finally ran out of words, she'd say something simple but powerful. "You're allowed to feel tired," she'd say. "Just don't quit." One winter she got sick, really sick. The doctors talked in careful tones, using words like manage and monitor. They spoke to her like she was already fading. I watched her listen politely, nodding,
then ask about other patients in the waiting room. She was more concerned about strangers than herself. When we got home, I asked her if she was scared. She looked at me and smiled gently. "I've been scared before," she said. "This isn't new." As the months passed, her body slowed, but her spirit didn't. She still cooked, still prayed, still laughed at old sitcoms. One night during a power outage, we sat in candlelight, shadows dancing on the walls. She told me stories she had never shared before, about dreams she gave up, chances she never took, and regrets she carried quietly. But she didn't speak with sorrow. She spoke with acceptance. "Life isn't about getting everything you want," she said. "It's about making peace with what you have." The last conversation we had changed me forever. I was scared of failing, scared of becoming nothing. I told her I didn't know if I was strong enough. She reached for my hand, her grip weak but firm. "You come from me," she said, "and I didn't break. Neither will you." When she passed away, the house felt different, quieter, colder. But her presence never left. It lived in the lessons she taught, the love she gave, and the strength she passed down. At her funeral, people stood up one by one, sharing stories I had never heard, how she helped them through divorce, loss, addiction, despair. I realized then that her life, though ordinary on the surface, had quietly changed countless others. Grandma Evie never wrote a book. She never went viral. She never stood on a stage and spoke to crowds. But her story mattered. Her resilience mattered. And her love continues to echo through everyone she touched. This is only the beginning of her story, because some lives are so deep they can't be told all at once.
After the funeral, life expected us to move on quickly, as if grief had a schedule. People returned to their routines, the casseroles stopped coming, and the phone went quiet again. But for me, Grandma Evie's voice lingered everywhere. In the creak of the floorboards, in the smell of bread rising in the oven, in the way sunlight fell across the kitchen table in the late afternoon. I stayed in her house for a while, unable to leave, feeling like if I walked away, I'd lose her all over again. One evening, while cleaning out a drawer she never locked, I found a small cardboard box tucked beneath folded napkins. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some yellowed with age, some neatly folded, others wrinkled like they'd been opened and closed too many times. They weren't addressed to anyone famous. They were written to herself. The dates stretched across decades. I sat on the floor and began to read. The first letter was written when she was barely 20. Her handwriting was careful, unsure, like she didn't fully believe she deserved the words she was putting down. She wrote about fear, about feeling small, about wondering if she was doing life right. She wrote about hoping her children would never know hunger the way she did. She ended the letter with a sentence that made my chest tighten. "If no one ever thanks you, thank yourself for staying." As I kept reading, I realized these letters were her way of surviving. When she couldn't speak out loud, she wrote. When the world ignored her, she witnessed herself. There were letters written during my grandfather's illness, letters after his death, letters during times when she felt invisible. But there were also letters filled with gratitude, simple things like a good cup of coffee, a warm blanket, a smile from a stranger. One letter, written years after my grandfather passed, stopped me completely. "Today I feel tired of being strong," she wrote, "but I got up anyway. Maybe strength isn't about feeling brave. Maybe it's about not letting sadness decide the day." I cried reading that because all my life I had seen her as unbreakable. But here, in her own words, she admitted she was tired, and yet she kept going. As days turned into weeks, people began stopping by the house. Neighbors I barely recognized, old friends, former coworkers. Each one carried a story about her. One man talked about how she once slipped him grocery money when he lost his job. A woman shared how Grandma Evie sat with her all night when her marriage fell apart. Someone else said she used to volunteer at the church quietly, refusing recognition. She never told us any of this. She didn't need applause. Helping was just who she was. It made me think about how many people walk this earth doing extraordinary things in complete silence. No cameras, no praise, just kindness given freely. Grandma Evie was one of them. One afternoon, my mother came over and sat with me at the table. She looked older somehow, like grief had added weight to her shoulders. She told me stories from her childhood I had never heard. How Grandma Evie would go without eating so her kids could have seconds. How she once sold her wedding ring to pay rent. How she cried quietly in the bathroom so no one would see. My mother said, "I didn't understand her when I was young. I thought she was too strict, too serious. Now I see she was carrying the weight of all of us." That realization hit me hard.
How often do we misunderstand the people who love us the most? How often do we judge their silence without knowing the battles they're fighting? One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the porch wrapped in one of her old sweaters. The air was cool, and the world felt still. I thought about my own life, my fears, my excuses. I had spent so much time afraid of failure, but she had lived through it and kept moving. I realized something then. Her greatest gift wasn't what she gave us materially. It was the example she set. She showed us how to endure with grace. A few weeks later, I decided to do something that scared me. I applied for an opportunity I had been avoiding for years, convinced I wasn't good enough. As I filled out the application, I felt her presence, like a quiet encouragement. "You come from me," she had said. I carried that with me. When I received the acceptance email, I cried, not just from happiness, but from gratitude. I wished I could tell her. I wished I could hear her say, "I knew you could do it." Instead, I whispered thank you into the empty room. Life didn't suddenly become easy. Challenges still came, just as they always do. But something inside me had shifted. I stopped running from discomfort. I stopped waiting for permission to live fully. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I asked myself what she would do. The answer was always simple: keep going. Months passed, and eventually we had to sell her house. Packing it up felt like dismantling a sacred space. On the last day, before handing over the keys, I stood alone in the kitchen. I placed my hand on the table where she once sat, listening to everyone else's problems. I promised her I would live a life that honored her sacrifices. Not a perfect life, but a meaningful one. As I walked out, I realized her story wasn't over. It lived on in me, in my family, in everyone she helped. Her life was proof that you don't need recognition to matter. You don't need wealth to be rich. And you don't need an easy path to leave a powerful legacy. This was the part of her story that changed me, the part where her strength became my own.
Years have a strange way of passing after someone like her is gone. They don't rush, and they don't stop either. They move quietly, like a river that looks calm on the surface but carries everything beneath it. I didn't notice the change at first, not in a dramatic way. It happened slowly, in moments so small they almost felt invisible. In the way I paused before speaking when someone was hurting. In the way I learned to listen without trying to fix everything. In the way I stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. That's when I understood something important. Grandma Evie didn't just raise children or comfort neighbors. She planted pieces of herself inside people, and those pieces kept growing long after she was gone. One afternoon, a couple of years later, I was standing in a grocery store line when I noticed an elderly woman in front of me counting coins with trembling hands. The cashier looked impatient. People behind her sighed. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that used to show up when Grandma Evie would quietly help someone without announcing it. Without thinking, I stepped forward and paid the difference. The woman looked at me like I had just saved her world. She kept saying thank you, her voice cracking, and all I could hear was my grandmother's voice saying, "If you can help, you do." I walked out of that store with tears in my eyes, realizing her lessons were still guiding my hands. Not long after that, life tested me in ways I wasn't prepared for. The opportunity I had worked so hard for began to fall apart. Promises were broken, people I trusted disappeared when things got difficult. I found myself sitting alone in my apartment one night, lights off, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of disappointment press down on my chest. Old fears came rushing back, the fear of not being enough, the fear of ending up nowhere. I whispered out loud, "I don't know if I can do this." And for the first time, instead of feeling alone, I felt supported. Not because everything was okay, but because I remembered she had felt this way too. And she survived it. I pulled out one of her letters that I had kept with me, folded carefully like a lifeline. I read it again, slowly. "Some days you will feel invisible," she wrote. "Do not confuse that with being unimportant." Those words steadied me. I didn't quit. I didn't give up. I took a breath, then another, and I kept moving forward, one small step at a time. As time went on, I began sharing her story with others, not in a dramatic way, just in quiet conversations. When someone felt lost or overwhelmed, I would say, "My grandmother used to say," and I'd see something shift in their eyes. Hope, maybe, or understanding. Sometimes people don't need advice. They need proof that someone else endured and made it through.
Grandma Evie became that proof for more people than she ever knew. One day, a teacher from my old school reached out. She said she remembered my grandmother from years ago, how she volunteered to help kids who were struggling, even when she herself had nothing extra to give. The teacher said, "Your grandmother made kids feel seen." That sentence stayed with me. Being seen. Isn't that what we all want? Grandma Evie gave that gift freely, without conditions. As I grew older, I began to understand the cost of the life she lived. The dreams she put aside, the rest she never fully took, the battles she fought quietly. And instead of feeling sad, I felt determined. Determined not to waste the strength she passed down. Determined to live with intention. Determined to love deeply, even when it hurt. There came a moment when I stood at a crossroads in my life, faced with a choice that would define my future. One path was safe, familiar, predictable. The other was uncertain, frightening, and filled with risk. I visited her grave that morning, the grass still wet with dew. I didn't speak right away. I just stood there, feeling the wind, listening to the quiet. Then I said, "You were brave. Teach me how." I chose the harder path. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with instant success. There were setbacks, long nights, moments of doubt. But there was also growth, purpose, a sense of living honestly. And through it all, I felt her presence, not as a voice, but as a strength inside me. Years later, I found myself telling her story to a room full of strangers. I hadn't planned it. It just came out. I spoke about a woman who lived simply, loved fiercely, and endured quietly. I spoke about resilience without recognition, about kindness without reward. When I finished, the room was silent. Then people began to clap. Not for me, but for her. Some were wiping their eyes. Others nodded like they understood something about their own lives. Afterwards, a young woman approached me and said, "I needed to hear that. I thought my life didn't matter because no one notices what I do." I smiled and told her, "It matters more than you know." In that moment, I realized Grandma Evie's legacy had reached yet another heart. Now when I think about her, I don't only think about loss. I think about continuity, about how love doesn't end. It transforms. It moves through generations, through actions, through quiet choices made when no one is watching. Her story reminds me that greatness doesn't have to be loud, that survival can be heroic, that ordinary lives can be extraordinary. If you're listening to this and feeling tired, unseen, or close to giving up, I want you to remember her. Remember a woman who started with nothing and gave everything she had. Remember that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "Try again tomorrow." And if she could carry her life with grace, so can you. Because somewhere, maybe without even realizing it, you are becoming someone else's Grandma Evie. And that is how stories like hers never truly end.